Sometimes a kingdom is saved not by the strongest warrior, but by the only person willing to question something everyone else blindly trusts. The first snowfall of winter had covered the stone roads leading to Blackwood Castle with a thin layer of white, turning the entire fortress into a quiet sea of silver beneath the pale morning sky. Merchants arrived before sunrise. Royal guards changed shifts along the outer walls. Stable hands hurried between the barns, brushing fresh snow from saddles and wagon wheels before the day's journey could begin. The castle was unusually busy, not because of a festival, not because of war, because the Alpha King himself was leaving on a secret inspection beyond the northern border. Very few people knew the true purpose of the journey. Most believed Ethan Carter simply wished to inspect the mountain villages before the winter storms became too severe. Only the king's closest advisors understood that rumors of growing unrest had reached the capital. Ethan intended to investigate personally, without ceremony, without announcing his destination. Grace Walker knew none of that. At 23 years old, she worked as a waitress inside the small traveler's tavern built beside the castle's northern gate. Every morning before dawn, she carried trays of hot bread, roasted meat, and steaming tea to soldiers preparing for long patrols. Most visitors never remembered her face. The guards greeted her politely. The nobles barely acknowledged her existence. Grace had grown used to being invisible. Invisibility had one unexpected advantage. People rarely stopped talking when a waitress entered the room. She quietly crossed the snowy courtyard carrying a wooden tray filled with fresh pastries wrapped in linen. The cold air painted her cheeks pink. Long strands of blonde hair escaped beneath her simple white headscarf despite her best efforts to keep them tucked away. Several royal guards smiled as she approached. "Morning, Grace." "Morning." She returned every greeting with the same warm smile she offered everyone, regardless of rank. Ahead of her, servants loaded travel supplies onto an elegant black royal carriage trimmed with polished silver. Thick wolf pelts, medical chests, maps, food for several days. Everything appeared perfectly organized, at least, until Grace noticed one tiny detail. A stable boy struggled to tighten one of the iron fittings beneath the carriage door. Another man, dressed as one of the royal carriage mechanics, stepped forward and quietly stopped him. "I'll finish it." His voice sounded calm. Too calm. Grace watched absent-mindedly while arranging cups of hot tea onto a nearby table. The mechanic knelt beside the carriage for only a few seconds before standing again. He wiped his gloves carefully with a cloth, then disappeared into the crowd without speaking to anyone. Something felt strangely wrong. Grace couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the way he avoided looking at the stable hands. Perhaps it was how quickly he left. Or perhaps it was the small iron locking pin now fixed beneath the carriage door. She had delivered meals beside these royal carriages for years. She knew what their hinges normally looked like. That pin had not been there yesterday. Grace slowly walked closer, pretending to collect empty wooden mugs abandoned by the guards. Without kneeling, she glanced beneath the carriage. The new metal pin reflected fresh scratches. It had been installed only moments ago. Her heartbeat slowed, not with fear, with concentration. She looked toward the wheels. Fresh snow covered 3 of them evenly. The 4th carried thin streaks of dark grease running across the rim. Someone had recently removed it. Why? A voice interrupted her thoughts. "The king is coming." Every guard immediately straightened. Trumpets sounded once across the courtyard. The great wooden gates opened. Alpha King Ethan Carter emerged from the castle wearing a dark winter cloak fastened over polished armor, his broad shoulders towering above everyone around him. Conversation stopped. Servants bowed. Soldiers saluted. Grace lowered her head respectfully like everyone else. But even as the Alpha King walked steadily toward the waiting carriage, her eyes remained fixed on that unfamiliar iron pin beneath the door. A quiet unease settled deep inside her chest. She did not yet know what danger it concealed. She only knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something about that carriage did not belong there. People rarely ignore danger because they cannot see it. They ignore it because they have already decided whom they will never believe. The snowy courtyard fell completely silent as Alpha King Ethan Carter crossed the stone path toward the waiting carriage. His dark cloak swayed behind him with every confident step. Royal guards formed 2 disciplined lines. Stable hands lowered their heads. Servants quickly moved aside. Grace Walker stood near a wooden serving table, quietly collecting empty cups after delivering hot tea to the king's escort. Her eyes never left the carriage. The strange iron pin beneath the door reflected the pale winter sunlight each time the wind shifted the hanging leather curtain. Something was terribly wrong. She simply couldn't explain why. Ethan stopped beside the carriage while Captain Marcus Reed, commander of the royal escort, unfolded a large parchment map. The northern pass should remain clear until sunset, Your Majesty. Ethan studied the route. We'll avoid the eastern forest. Marcus nodded. Bandits. Snow. Grace listened without meaning to. Years of serving travelers had taught her something valuable. People always revealed more than they intended while eating or preparing to leave. She glanced back toward the carriage. The same mechanic she had noticed earlier was gone. No tools. No horse. No explanation. Almost as if he had never existed. A stable boy approached carrying another saddle blanket. Grace stepped closer. Excuse me. The young boy smiled politely. Yes, Miss Grace. The man repairing the carriage. What man? The mechanic. The stable boy frowned. We didn't have a mechanic here today. Grace felt her stomach tighten. I saw him. The boy shook his head. We repaired everything yesterday. Then he hurried away before she could ask another question. Grace turned back toward the carriage. If no mechanic had been scheduled, who installed the new pin? Her heartbeat grew heavier. Not from panic. From certainty. She quietly walked across the courtyard carrying her empty tray, pretending to gather abandoned wooden bowls from nearby benches. Each step brought her closer. She passed behind one of the horses. Then another. Finally, she stood only a few feet from the carriage. Without drawing attention, she lowered herself as though retrieving a dropped spoon. Her eyes slipped beneath the carriage floor. Fresh scrape marks covered the wooden frame. Not random scratches. Parallel lines. As though something heavy had recently been pushed into place beneath the cabin. Grace slowly looked toward the axle. A thin leather cord disappeared behind one of the wheels before vanishing into the carriage itself. Her breathing stopped. That cord shouldn't have been there. A loud voice interrupted her. You there? Grace quickly stood. Captain Marcus stared directly at her. What are you doing? She hesitated only a moment. I think something is wrong with the carriage. Several nearby guards exchanged amused glances. Marcus folded his arms. Wrong. Grace nodded. The locking pin is new. The axle has fresh marks. And there's a leather cord beneath the floor. A few soldiers laughed quietly. Marcus looked toward the carriage for barely a second before returning his attention to Grace. You inspect royal transport now? No, sir. But, he raised one hand. Enough. Grace swallowed. I only thought His Majesty should know before. Marcus took one firm step closer. The Alpha King does not delay his journey because a waitress has concerns about wagon parts. The surrounding guards chuckled. Grace lowered her eyes. Not from embarrassment. From frustration. She knew how ridiculous she sounded. She had no proof. Only observations. Only instincts. Marcus dismissed her with a brief wave. Return to your tavern. Ethan, standing several yards away, had heard only fragments of the conversation. He glanced briefly toward Grace. For the smallest moment, their eyes met. Grace wanted to speak, to explain everything. Instead, another noble stepped between them. The opportunity disappeared. Trumpets sounded once more. A servant reached for the polished carriage door. Ethan began walking toward it. Grace remained frozen where she stood. Every instinct inside her screamed the same warning. If that door opened, something terrible was about to happen. Courage is rarely loud. Most of the time, it is a single heartbeat telling you to move while everyone else stands perfectly still. Grace watched the servant's hand reach toward the polished brass handle of the royal carriage. Only a few more steps separated Alpha King Ethan Carter from the door. The courtyard held its breath. Snowflakes drifted silently through the cold morning air. Every instinct inside Grace screamed the same warning. Move. She gripped the edge of the wooden tray so tightly that her knuckles turned white. If she stayed silent, nothing might happen. If she spoke, everyone would remember the foolish waitress who interrupted the Alpha King's departure. But what if she was right? Her thoughts flashed back to the leather cord hidden beneath the carriage. The fresh scratches. The unfamiliar locking pin. The man no one else seemed to remember seeing. Separate details meant nothing. Together, they formed a picture she could no longer ignore. Grace set the tray onto a nearby barrel. Without asking permission, she hurried across the courtyard. The nearest guards immediately stepped into her path. Stop! She froze. Captain Marcus Reed looked at her with growing irritation. I already warned you. Grace struggled to steady her breathing. Please, just let me check the carriage one more time. Marcus folded his arms. You've delayed the king's departure long enough. I only need a few seconds. You need none. Several nobles standing nearby exchanged amused smiles. One elderly lord shook his head. The girl has lost her senses. Another laughed quietly. Perhaps serving hot ale has filled her head with stories. Grace ignored them. Her eyes searched Ethan's face. The Alpha King had nearly reached the carriage. If she failed now, there would be no second chance. She took another step. Two guards crossed their spears before her. Stay back. Grace looked desperately toward Captain Marcus. I'm begging you. The locking pin beneath the door wasn't there yesterday. The wheel has been removed. There's something hidden underneath. Marcus sighed heavily. Enough. The carriage was inspected. By whom? Grace asked before she could stop herself. Marcus frowned. Our royal craftsman. Which craftsman? For the first time, Marcus hesitated. Only briefly. Long enough for Grace to notice. She remembered the stable boy's words. There had been no mechanic. Not today. Grace's pulse quickened. Captain, there wasn't any repair scheduled this morning. The courtyard grew strangely quiet. Marcus stepped closer until only inches separated them. Listen carefully. His voice became low enough that only Grace could hear. The Alpha King has enemies everywhere. That is exactly why trained men protect him. Not tavern waitresses. Grace held his gaze. I know. But trained men can overlook something small. Marcus gave a humorless smile. And you think you found what an entire royal escort missed? I don't know. She answered honestly. I only know something feels wrong. Behind Marcus, Ethan placed one gloved hand against the carriage door. A servant reached to open it. Grace's heart pounded painfully. The leather cord beneath the carriage suddenly tightened. Only slightly. Barely enough for anyone else to notice. But she saw it. The cord moved. Someone had just pulled it. Grace's eyes widened. There was no more time to argue. No more time to explain. No more time to convince anyone. Before the guards could stop her, Grace slipped between them with surprising speed. Marcus shouted her name. Soldiers lunged forward. Several nobles gasped. Grace ignored every voice around her. She ran straight toward the Alpha King. Ethan turned just as she reached him. For one suspended heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then Grace thrust herself between him and the carriage door, throwing both hands against the polished wood. Her voice echoed across the frozen courtyard. Don't open that carriage. Silence crashed over everyone. The wind itself seemed to stop. Every face turned toward the trembling waitress standing in front of the Alpha King. No one understood why she had risked her life. No one, except Grace. Because somewhere beneath that beautiful royal carriage, death was already waiting. Truth needs only a single heartbeat to prove itself. Lies require perfect timing, and perfect timing had just run out. For one endless second, no one moved. Grace stood with both palms pressed against the polished carriage door, her breathing uneven from the desperate sprint across the courtyard. Snow drifted softly around her. The Alpha King stood only inches away. Captain Marcus reached her first. He grabbed her arm firmly. Step away. Grace shook her head. No. His expression darkened. You've crossed every boundary. I don't care. Several nobles gasped. A waitress had just refused a direct order from the commander of the royal guard. Marcus tightened his grip. Remove her. Two soldiers stepped forward. Grace looked past them toward Ethan. She did not beg. She did not cry. She simply spoke. Please trust me. I don't know what's hidden inside. But if you open that door, someone will die. The courtyard fell silent again. Every eye turned toward the Alpha King. Ethan studied Grace carefully. Her cheeks were pale from the cold. Snow rested across her blonde hair. Fear filled her eyes. Not fear of punishment. Fear for him. It was genuine. Marcus bowed slightly. Your Majesty, allow us to escort her away. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the carriage. Then back toward Grace. You believe the carriage is dangerous? Yes. What proof do you have? Grace lowered her eyes for a brief moment. None. The surrounding nobles smiled with quiet satisfaction. One whispered, I knew it. Grace continued. I only have what I saw. The new locking pin. The leather cord. The fresh wheel marks. and a mechanic who doesn't exist. Marcus exhaled impatiently. Enough. He stepped toward the carriage. I'll prove there's nothing inside. Grace's heartbeat stopped. No. But Marcus had already reached the polished brass handle. He wrapped his hand around it, then pulled. Nothing happened. The door remained shut. Marcus frowned. It shouldn't. He pulled harder. Still nothing. The strange iron pin beneath the door shifted almost invisibly. Grace saw it. So did Ethan. The Alpha King's eyes narrowed. Stop. Marcus froze instantly. Ethan slowly approached the carriage. Instead of reaching for the handle, he crouched beside the lower frame. His gloved fingers brushed against the unfamiliar iron pin. Who installed this? No one answered. The stable hands exchanged confused looks. One finally stepped forward. Your Majesty, that pin wasn't there yesterday. Marcus turned sharply. What? The stable master nodded nervously. We never replaced it. Ethan looked beneath the carriage. For only a moment. Then his expression changed completely. The leather cord. Grace whispered. Ethan followed it with his eyes. The thin cord disappeared beneath the floorboards before vanishing inside the carriage wall. He stood immediately. No one touches the carriage. His command thundered across the courtyard. Every soldier stepped back. Captain Marcus drew his sword. Clear the area. Guards hurried to push servants and nobles away. Grace remained exactly where she was. Her legs refused to move. Ethan calmly removed a hunting knife from his belt. Instead of opening the carriage door, he threw the blade downward. The knife sliced through the leather cord beneath the axle. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a deafening crack shattered the winter morning. The carriage door burst outward as dozens of concealed steel bolts fired through the empty cabin with terrifying force. Wood splintered into the air. Glass exploded across the snow. A second later, hidden jars of burning oil ignited beneath the carriage floor. Flames roared upward. Black smoke swallowed the royal vehicle in seconds. Horses screamed. Guards rushed forward. Servants scattered in panic. Several nobles stumbled backward, their faces drained of all color. Grace instinctively shielded her face from the heat. When the fire finally settled enough for everyone to see, the inside of the carriage had become a deadly cage of twisted steel bolts embedded in every wooden wall. Not one passenger could have survived. Silence returned to the courtyard. Only the crackling flames remained. Ethan slowly turned toward Grace. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Every person standing before the burning carriage had just witnessed the same impossible truth. The waitress everyone had mocked had saved the Alpha King's life only moments before disaster claimed it. A king can survive an assassin's blade. Surviving the realization that the assassin stood inside his own walls is far more difficult. The burning carriage continued to crackle behind them. Columns of black smoke curled into the pale winter sky, while shattered pieces of polished wood lay scattered across the snow like broken bones. No one spoke. The nobles who had laughed only moments earlier now stared silently at the wreckage. Several guards slowly lowered their weapons. Even Captain Marcus Reed seemed unable to look away from the deadly steel bolts buried deep inside the carriage walls. One bolt had pierced completely through the opposite door. Had Ethan entered the carriage, there would have been no escape. The Alpha King finally turned toward Grace. For several long seconds, he simply studied her. She stood quietly where she had stopped him. Her breathing had steadied, but her hands still trembled from everything that had happened. She expected to be questioned, perhaps even arrested until the investigation ended. Instead, Ethan asked only one question. When did you first know? Grace shook her head gently. I didn't know. I suspected. His expression remained calm. What made you suspicious? She glanced toward the burning carriage. The mechanic. Marcus frowned. We've already confirmed no mechanic was assigned today. Grace nodded. That's why I couldn't stop thinking about him. She slowly pointed toward the damaged axle. The new locking pin. The fresh scratches. The leather cord. None of them belonged together. I kept hoping I was wrong. Silence returned. Captain Marcus looked visibly unsettled. I inspected this carriage myself before dawn. Grace met his eyes respectfully. I believe you. Then how did this happen? She hesitated. Someone prepared everything after your inspection. Marcus clenched his jaw. That possibility was worse than any other. It meant the assassin had known exactly when to strike. It also meant someone inside the castle had helped. Ethan looked toward the remaining guards. Seal every gate. His voice was cold enough to silence the entire courtyard. No one leaves. Not servants. Not nobles. Not soldiers. The captain bowed immediately. Yes, your majesty. Within seconds, horns echoed across the castle grounds. Heavy gates slammed shut. Archers hurried onto the walls. Messengers raced toward every tower. The entire fortress shifted from peaceful departure to complete lockdown. Grace watched the sudden chaos with growing unease. She had only wanted to stop the king from entering the carriage. She had never imagined exposing something this large. A royal investigator approached carrying a thick leather satchel. After carefully examining the wreckage, he called Ethan over. Your Majesty. He lifted a small metal cylinder from beneath the carriage floor using iron tongs. It wasn't just a trap. He carefully brushed away soot. Inside the cracked cylinder rested black powder and fragments of sharpened steel. The explosion was designed to force these bolts outward. The investigator swallowed. It was built by someone with military knowledge. Marcus's face hardened. Not common bandits. No. The investigator looked directly at the Alpha King. This required access to royal workshops. Another silence settled over the courtyard. This time, it felt heavier. Grace noticed Ethan's gaze drifting across every person standing nearby. Not with anger. With calculation. He was no longer searching for a weapon. He was searching for betrayal. Without warning, one frightened stable hand fell to his knees. Your Majesty, please believe me. I didn't know anything. Another servant quickly followed. Then another. Fear spread through the courtyard faster than the fire itself. Everyone suddenly understood the same terrifying truth. The assassin had not attacked from outside the kingdom. Someone inside Blackwood Castle had prepared the carriage. Someone had expected the Alpha King to die before noon. Ethan slowly looked back at Grace. The only reason I'm still alive, his voice remained calm, is because one waitress noticed what an entire castle failed to see. Around them, every noble lowered their eyes. None dared argue. None dared laugh again. For the first time since arriving at the castle years ago, Grace Walker was no longer invisible. And somewhere behind the frightened faces surrounding her, the true traitor had just realized one disastrous mistake. The waitress they had dismissed had survived long enough to become the only witness standing between them and the Alpha King. The most dangerous enemy is not the one hiding outside the gates. It is the one calmly watching beside you while pretending to share your victory. The castle had never been so quiet. Not after battles. Not after funerals. Not even after the death of Ethan Carter's father years before. Fear had replaced every ordinary sound. The burned carriage remained untouched in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by armed guards. No servant was allowed near it. No noble was permitted to leave. Every corridor inside Blackwood Castle echoed with hurried footsteps as soldiers searched workshops, storage rooms, stables, and servant quarters. The hunt had begun. Grace Walker stood near one of the stone pillars beneath the castle entrance. She suddenly felt out of place. Only an hour earlier, she had been carrying breakfast trays. Now she stood inside the largest security investigation the kingdom had ever witnessed. Captain Marcus approached her quietly. His face looked older than it had that morning. I owe you an apology. Grace looked surprised. You don't owe me anything. I dismissed your warning. You were protecting the king. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly. And you protected him better. Before Grace could answer, another squad of guards hurried into the courtyard. One of them carried a leather tool bag recovered from the royal workshop. The investigator immediately emptied its contents across a wooden table. Ordinary chisels, hammer, nails, metal files. Then, one identical iron locking pin. The entire courtyard became silent. Marcus picked it up carefully. The same design. The investigator nodded. It was forged inside the castle. Another guard stepped forward carrying a ledger. We questioned every blacksmith. One apprentice is missing. Marcus frowned. When did he disappear? Just after sunrise. His room is empty. Grace watched Ethan carefully. The Alpha King remained perfectly still. Almost too still. His expression revealed nothing. But his eyes moved from one face to another, quietly measuring every reaction. He wasn't looking for evidence anymore. He was studying people. One noble spoke first. The missing apprentice must be responsible. Several others quickly agreed. He's fled. That proves his guilt. The investigation is over. Grace listened silently. Something bothered her. If the apprentice truly planned the assassination, why leave behind identical parts inside the workshop? Why disappear so obviously? It felt convenient. She slowly stepped toward Marcus. Captain. He turned. May I ask something? He nodded. Grace looked at the iron pin. If someone wanted to blame the apprentice, they would leave evidence pointing directly to him. Marcus remained silent. She continued. If I wanted to hide the real traitor, I would make sure everyone stopped searching after finding one missing man. Marcus's eyes narrowed. The investigator looked up immediately. No one had considered that. Ethan finally spoke. Continue. Grace took a careful breath. The assassin knew exactly when your majesty would leave. They knew your route. They entered the carriage after the morning inspection. They had access to the royal workshop. She looked around the frozen courtyard. That requires more than one person. It requires someone trusted. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably. One elderly advisor crossed his arms. A waitress speaks boldly for someone with no knowledge of royal affairs. Grace met his gaze calmly. I know nothing about politics. I only know what criminals do. And criminals rarely leave perfect evidence unless they want someone else arrested. The words settled heavily over the gathering. Ethan looked toward Marcus. Remove the apprentice from the list of confirmed suspects. Marcus nodded. As you command. And quietly investigate everyone who recommended ending the search. Several nobles visibly stiffened. The order had changed everything. The trap was no longer pointing outward. It had turned inward. As soldiers dispersed once again, Grace noticed a man standing beneath the castle balcony. A richly dressed court steward. He appeared calm. Too calm. For only a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Then he smiled. Not warmly. Not gratefully. It was the smallest smile imaginable. Cold. Measured. Almost. Amused. Before Grace could point him out, he disappeared into the crowded hallway beyond the great doors. A strange chill crept down her spine. The apprentice had not frightened her. That smile did. Because for the first time since saving the Alpha King, Grace realized the true mastermind had just seen her face. And now, the only witness capable of unraveling the conspiracy had become the next obstacle standing in the traitor's path. The moment a hidden enemy realizes you can recognize them, you stop being a witness. You become the next target. Night settled over Blackwood Castle beneath a blanket of silence. The great halls remained brightly lit, but no music echoed through the stone corridors. No laughter drifted from the banquet room. Every servant walked with lowered eyes. Every guard rested one hand on his sword. The failed assassination had changed the castle forever. Grace Walker quietly carried a tray of fresh bread toward the royal kitchens. Although Ethan had publicly acknowledged that she had saved his life, she insisted on returning to work. It was the only life she knew. The older kitchen maid smiled gently. You should be resting. Grace returned the smile. I wouldn't know how. Before the woman could answer, heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway. Captain Marcus appeared. Grace. She immediately stopped. The Alpha King requests your presence. Several servants exchanged surprised glances. Grace quietly followed him through the castle. Neither of them spoke until they reached Ethan's private study. Marcus opened the heavy oak door. Your Majesty. Ethan stood beside a large table covered with maps, reports, and lists of names gathered during the investigation. Only 3 candles burned inside the room. Their soft light cast long shadows across the walls. You wish to see me? Grace asked softly. Ethan nodded. I did. Marcus closed the door behind them. Ethan walked toward the window overlooking the dark courtyard. The investigation has uncovered something. He handed Grace a folded parchment. It contained work assignments from the previous evening. Royal workshops, stable rotations, guard patrols, kitchen deliveries. Grace studied the names. Then one line caught her attention. A food delivery signed by court steward Adrian Holloway. She looked up. The steward. Ethan watched her carefully. He personally approved access to the royal carriage storage after midnight. Grace remembered the man beneath the balcony. The cold smile. He saw me. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. I believe he did. Marcus added quietly. Unfortunately, there is no evidence connecting him directly to the trap. Grace lowered the parchment. So he knows we're looking, and he knows you noticed him. Marcus answered. The room fell silent. Ethan finally broke it. From this moment forward, you will no longer work alone. Grace blinked. I don't need protection. You do. I don't want soldiers following me. They won't. Ethan looked toward Marcus. The guards attract attention. We need something quieter. Marcus nodded once. I've already arranged it. Grace frowned. Arranged what? Before either man answered, someone knocked gently on the study door. Marcus opened it. An elderly woman entered carrying a basket of folded linens. She bowed politely. Grace recognized her immediately. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, one of the oldest laundry workers in the castle. She had worked there longer than anyone could remember. Marcus smiled faintly. She isn't only a laundry maid. Eleanor straightened. Her gentle posture disappeared instantly. Her eyes became sharp, confident, professional. I served in the Royal Intelligence Corps before retiring. Grace stared in disbelief. Eleanor smiled. People rarely notice old women carrying laundry. They tell us everything. Ethan folded his hands behind his back. From today, Eleanor stays close to you. Not as your servant, as your shadow. Grace slowly understood. The castle was no longer protecting a waitress. It was protecting its most valuable witness. Before anyone could speak again, frantic footsteps raced down the corridor. The study door burst open. A young guard struggled to catch his breath. Your Majesty. Marcus immediately stepped forward. What happened? The guard swallowed hard. The apprentice blacksmith. We found him. Silence filled the room. Alive? Ethan asked. The guard's face turned pale. No, Your Majesty. He was found outside the eastern wall. Marcus's expression hardened. How? The young soldier lowered his eyes. He never escaped. He was murdered. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. The apprentice had been framed. Now, the only person who could have cleared his name had been silenced forever, which meant the real mastermind had just erased another witness. And Grace suddenly understood one terrifying truth. She was now the last person alive who had seen the conspiracy begin. When the truth begins closing in, desperate people stop making careful plans. They start making fatal mistakes. Dawn arrived beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Blackwood Castle woke slowly, but nothing about the morning felt ordinary. The eastern courtyard had been sealed overnight. The murdered apprentice had been taken to the chapel. Soldiers guarded every entrance. No one trusted anyone anymore. Grace stood beside a narrow kitchen window, watching the snow settle across the empty training grounds. She could not stop thinking about the young blacksmith. He had not been the assassin. He had been another victim. Someone had eliminated him before he could speak. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor Hayes entered carrying a basket of folded towels. To anyone watching, she looked exactly like an elderly laundry maid beginning another day's work. Only Grace knew better. Eleanor placed the basket on the table. I have something for you. She lifted one towel. Hidden beneath it was a small leather notebook. Grace frowned. What is this? A record. Of what? People who lie without realizing they are lying. Grace looked confused. Eleanor smiled gently. Everyone remembers important events. They rarely remember ordinary details. She opened the notebook. Yesterday, I asked 23 servants the same question. Grace leaned closer. Who delivered breakfast to the royal workshop before sunrise? Eleanor nodded. Most answered honestly. Some admitted they didn't know. And 3 people gave exactly the same answer. Grace read the names. Each claimed court steward Adrian Holloway personally inspected the workshop before dawn. What does that mean? Eleanor quietly closed the notebook. It means someone taught them what to say. Grace slowly understood. Witnesses rarely repeated identical words unless they had practiced them. Someone had prepared their testimony. Footsteps echoed outside. Marcus entered quickly. Your Majesty wants both of you. Minutes later, they joined Ethan inside the council chamber. Several senior advisors had already gathered around a large oak table. Maps covered its surface. Evidence from the Carriage attack lay carefully arranged beside them. The damaged locking pin, the severed leather cord, fragments of the explosive device. Ethan looked toward Grace. I want everyone here to hear what you noticed. Grace hesitated. I don't know if it matters. It does. She carefully explained everything. The false mechanic, the strange wheel marks, the hidden cord, the apprentice. Then Eleanor presented her notebook. Silence followed. One council member finally spoke. Coincidence? Eleanor calmly answered. No. People invent different lies. They rarely invent identical ones. Another advisor frowned. You accused the royal steward with nothing but assumptions. Before Eleanor could respond, the chamber doors opened. Court steward Adrian Holloway entered, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed. He bowed respectfully. My apologies for arriving late. Grace felt the same chill she had felt beneath the castle balcony. That same controlled smile remained on his face. Adrian looked directly at Ethan. I've brought updated financial records from the royal workshops. His voice remained smooth, confident, not a trace of nervousness. Ethan accepted the ledger without comment, then placed it unopened on the table. Tell me something, Adrian. Of course, Your Majesty. Where were you between midnight and sunrise yesterday? For the first time, the steward did not answer immediately. Only a heartbeat, barely noticeable. But Grace saw it. So did Eleanor. Adrian smiled again. I inspected supply inventories. Alone. Naturally. Marcus quietly unfolded another document. Interesting. Because 3 witnesses insist they were with you. The steward's smile faded almost invisibly. Only for an instant. Then it returned. Grace watched his eyes instead of his face. His expression remained calm. His eyes did not. For one brief moment, they shifted toward the chamber's side entrance. Not toward Marcus. Not toward Ethan. Toward an escape. Grace suddenly realized something. Adrian had not entered the room expecting questions. He had entered expecting complete control. And the moment that control slipped away, the most dangerous man inside Blackwood Castle began calculating how many more people would have to die before his secret disappeared forever. A patient king does not rush to catch a traitor. He waits until the traitor believes victory is only one step away. The council chamber emptied slowly. One by one, the senior advisors bowed before Alpha King Ethan Carter and disappeared into the stone corridors. Only Ethan remained. Captain Marcus stood beside the great oak doors. Grace and Eleanor waited silently near the long council table. No one spoke until the heavy doors closed. Then Ethan looked directly at Marcus. Lock them. The captain slid 2 iron bolts across the entrance. The sound echoed through the chamber. Grace frowned. Your Majesty? Ethan walked toward the large map spread across the table. His finger rested on the northern road where the destroyed carriage had been scheduled to travel. They've failed once. He looked up. They won't wait long before trying again. Marcus folded his arms. The steward knows we're suspicious. Good. Grace blinked. You wanted him to know? Ethan nodded. I wanted him to believe we've reached the wrong conclusion. He unfolded another parchment. It contained tomorrow's travel order. The kingdom will announce that I postponed my northern inspection. Grace looked confused. But you haven't. No. Marcus smiled faintly. We're leaving tomorrow. Using another carriage? Ethan shook his head. No. Using the same one. Silence filled the room. Grace stared at him. The carriage was destroyed. Exactly. Ethan calmly pointed toward the blueprint beside it. Tonight the royal craftsman will rebuild it. It will appear identical. The steward will hear about it. Eleanor understood immediately. You're giving him another opportunity. Ethan nodded once. I don't need him to deny his guilt. I need him to reveal his accomplices. Marcus spread another map across the table. We've already replaced half the escort. The new guards answer only to me. Grace quietly listened. Every detail had already been prepared. Ethan had not been reacting. He had been planning. Then he looked toward Grace. I need your help. She hesitated. What can I do? You'll return to the tavern. Act exactly as before. No special treatment. No royal protection anyone can see. Grace frowned. If Adrian believes I'm unprotected, he'll watch you. Marcus finished the thought. And when people watch someone, they eventually reveal themselves. Grace slowly understood. She was becoming bait. Ethan noticed the concern in her eyes. I won't ask unless you're willing. She remained silent for several seconds. She remembered the burned carriage, the murdered apprentice, the frightened stable hands. Finally she nodded. If this ends the conspiracy, I'll do it. Ethan inclined his head respectfully. Thank you. Later that afternoon, Grace returned to the small tavern outside the northern gate. Everything looked strangely ordinary. Travelers drank hot cider. Merchants argued over prices. Stable boys laughed while carrying sacks of grain. For a brief moment, she almost believed life had returned to normal. Then she noticed him. A stranger sat alone in the darkest corner of the tavern. Simple cloak, ordinary boots. Nothing remarkable. Except, he never touched his food. His eyes quietly followed Grace every time she crossed the room. She pretended not to notice. Eleanor's advice echoed inside her mind. When someone believes they're invisible, they stop hiding. Grace continued serving customers naturally. Hours passed. The stranger remained. Near sunset, another man entered the tavern. He approached the seated stranger without ordering anything. They exchanged only a few whispered words. Then the newcomer slipped a folded piece of parchment beneath the table before leaving immediately. Grace kept walking as though carrying another tray of bread. Without turning her head, she caught one sentence. The carriage leaves at dawn. The stranger nodded once. So does the king. Grace's pulse quickened. The bait had worked. Someone had just confirmed that news from inside the castle was reaching people outside its walls within hours. This was no longer the work of one ambitious steward. It was an organized network. Grace quietly finished serving the room before carrying an empty pitcher toward the kitchen. The moment she stepped through the back door, she found Marcus waiting in the shadows. He had been there all along. Grace spoke only 4 words. They took the bait. Marcus smiled for the first time in days. So did we. Far across the courtyard beyond the tavern windows, court steward Adrian Holloway stood beneath the fading evening sky, watching the rebuilt royal carriage being prepared for departure. Confidence slowly returned to his face. He believed the Alpha King had survived once by chance. Tomorrow, he intended to make certain there would not be a second miracle. The easiest trap to escape is the one you can see. The most dangerous trap is the one you believe belongs to someone else. A pale winter dawn spread across Blackwood Castle. Fresh snow concealed the scars left by yesterday's fire, but no one inside the fortress had forgotten what had happened. The rebuilt royal carriage stood in the center of the courtyard. Its polished black panels reflected the morning light so perfectly that few could tell it had been rebuilt overnight. Only Ethan Carter, Captain Marcus Reed, a handful of trusted craftsmen, and Grace Walker knew the truth. Everything else was theater. Servants hurried back and forth loading blankets, travel chests, food supplies, and sealed maps into the carriage. The performance had to look convincing. From an upper balcony, court steward Adrian Holloway watched every movement with quiet satisfaction. He folded his hands behind his back, exactly as Ethan had expected. Grace remained outside the northern tavern carrying baskets of fresh bread to the waiting escort. She behaved exactly as she always had. She smiled politely, thanked customers, spoke naturally with the stable boys. Anyone watching would believe yesterday's events had changed nothing. Only Marcus knew that 6 plain-clothed royal scouts had already surrounded the square, hidden among merchants, blacksmiths, travelers, even 2 elderly beggars sitting near the gate. Every one of them carried concealed weapons beneath worn winter cloaks. The trap was ready. Shortly after sunrise, Grace noticed the same stranger from the previous evening. He entered the courtyard, pushing a handcart loaded with barrels of salted fish. His beard appeared thicker today. His clothing had changed, but his walk had not. She recognized him instantly. He slowed as he passed the rebuilt carriage. Without stopping, he casually brushed one gloved hand beneath the rear axle. One smooth motion, almost invisible. Then he continued walking. Grace kept pouring hot tea into wooden cups. She never looked toward him again. Instead, she quietly wiped her hands on her apron. That simple movement was the agreed signal. Marcus saw it immediately. He spoke without moving his lips. Now, across the courtyard, disguised royal scouts began shifting into position. Not rushing, not drawing attention, simply closing every possible escape. The stranger sensed it one heartbeat too late. His eyes flicked toward the eastern gate. Blocked. The western road. Blocked. The stable entrance. Blocked. He abandoned the cart and sprinted. Stop him, Marcus shouted. The quiet courtyard exploded into motion. Merchants leaped aside. Soldiers threw off heavy cloaks. The disguised beggars rose with surprising speed. The fleeing man darted between frightened horses before vaulting over stacked grain sacks. Marcus pursued him closely. Grace remained exactly where she had been instructed, watching, observing. The chase crossed the frozen square before reaching the narrow alley beside the royal workshops. The stranger suddenly pulled a small glass sphere from inside his coat. Marcus recognized it immediately. Down. The sphere shattered against the stone wall. A cloud of thick gray smoke swallowed the alley. Guards coughed violently. Visibility disappeared. For several tense seconds, no one could see anything. Then another voice echoed through the smoke. He's climbing. Grace looked toward the castle wall. A dark figure had reached the outer staircase leading toward the old watchtower. He moved with remarkable speed, too fast for an ordinary courier. Marcus followed without hesitation. Ethan remained perfectly still beside the carriage. His eyes never left the tower. He isn't escaping. Grace looked at him. What? Ethan answered quietly. He's running toward someone. The words sent a chill through her. This man was never meant to survive alone. He was leading them somewhere. High above the courtyard, the fleeing messenger reached the watchtower landing. He looked behind only once, then raised one hand, not in surrender. As a signal, a second figure stepped from the shadows behind him, well-dressed, calm, unhurried. Even from across the courtyard, Grace recognized the familiar posture before she saw his face. Court Steward Adrian Holloway. The mastermind had finally stepped into the open, and for the first time since the conspiracy began, he was no longer hiding behind anyone else. The moment a man believes he still controls the game is often the exact moment he has already lost it. Snow swirled around the ancient watchtower as Captain Marcus Reed led his men up the narrow stone staircase. Every step echoed through the cold morning air. No one spoke. Above them, Court Steward Adrian Holloway stood beside the hooded messenger without showing the slightest hint of panic. His hands remained calmly folded behind his back. Grace watched from the courtyard below, her heartbeat quickening. She expected Adrian to flee. Instead, he waited. Marcus reached the final landing first. Don't move. A dozen crossbows instantly rose toward the two men. The messenger slowly lifted his hands. Adrian simply smiled. You've mistaken this situation, Captain. Marcus answered coldly. Have I? You've cornered a royal steward. I've cornered a traitor. Several soldiers stepped forward. Adrian never resisted. Instead, he looked directly toward Ethan Carter standing beside the rebuilt carriage below. Your Majesty. His voice carried easily across the courtyard. I've served your family faithfully for 12 years. You know I would never betray the crown. Ethan remained silent. Adrian continued. The man beside me forced me here. The messenger immediately turned toward him. What? You promised. Before he could finish, Adrian calmly interrupted. This criminal threatened my family. He ordered me to provide access to the workshops. Grace immediately understood. He was sacrificing his own accomplice. The messenger lunged toward Adrian in fury. You liar. Before anyone could stop him, Adrian stepped aside. Marcus reacted instantly. His sword struck the messenger's wrist. A hidden dagger clattered across the frozen stones. Soldiers overwhelmed him within seconds. Bound, disarmed, helpless, Adrian slowly adjusted his sleeve as though nothing unusual had happened. You see, I've cooperated. Marcus narrowed his eyes. It isn't that simple. No. Adrian looked almost amused. Then where is your proof? Silence settled over the tower. He was right. The messenger could connect him to secret meetings. Perhaps to workshop access. But not to the assassination itself. Everything Adrian had done had been carefully hidden behind legitimate authority. Every order carried his official seal. Every witness believed they had simply followed routine instructions. Grace suddenly remembered something. Not evidence. A question. She stepped forward carefully. May I ask him something? Marcus glanced toward Ethan. The Alpha King nodded. Grace looked directly into Adrian's eyes. When the carriage exploded, you weren't surprised. Adrian smiled politely. I heard the explosion like everyone else. Grace shook her head. No. You looked toward me. His smile faded slightly. You already knew someone had survived. Silence. Grace continued. Everyone else looked at the fire. You looked for the witness. For the first time, Adrian did not answer immediately. Marcus noticed it too. Grace took another step. You smiled at me beneath the balcony. You weren't relieved. You were checking whether I had recognized you. Adrian's calm expression slowly disappeared. Only for a heartbeat. But Ethan saw it. Marcus saw it. So did every soldier standing on the tower. Ethan finally spoke. Interesting. Adrian turned toward him. Your Majesty? You've denied every accusation. Yes. You've blamed everyone except yourself. I've told the truth. Ethan climbed the final steps toward the tower. His voice remained steady. I haven't accused you of placing the explosive. Adrian blinked. I never mentioned an explosive. The watchtower became completely silent. Grace felt her breath catch. Marcus slowly turned toward the steward. Only 3 people had known the carriage contained an explosive device before the investigation. The royal craftsman, the investigators, and the person who placed it. Adrian realized his mistake too late. His eyes widened for only an instant. One careless sentence, one unconscious defense. He had revealed knowledge that no innocent man could possibly possess. Ethan stopped only a few feet away. There it is. The Alpha King's voice was calm. The truth doesn't usually collapse because of a sword. It collapses because liars eventually forget which secrets they're pretending not to know. For the first time since the conspiracy began, Adrian Holloway had no answer. And as the soldiers closed around him once more, everyone in Blackwood Castle understood that the most dangerous traitor in the kingdom had finally destroyed himself with his own words. A kingdom does not remember the day a traitor was arrested. It remembers the day the truth was spoken where no lie could survive. By noon, the great hall of Blackwood Castle was filled beyond capacity. Nobles stood shoulder to shoulder beneath towering stone pillars. Royal guards lined the walls in polished armor. Servants gathered quietly near the back of the chamber. Word had spread faster than winter wind. The Alpha King had called a public judgment. Grace Walker remained beside Eleanor Hayes near one of the entrance columns. She had never stood inside the great hall as anything more than an invisible waitress. Today, every eye occasionally drifted toward her, some with curiosity, others with gratitude, many with disbelief. Court Steward Adrian Holloway entered under heavy guard. His hands were bound with iron restraints, yet he walked with remarkable composure. His face revealed neither fear nor anger, only silence. Behind him came the captured messenger. Unlike Adrian, the man struggled constantly against his chains. Marcus Reed stepped forward and addressed the court. By order of Alpha King Ethan Carter, this hearing concerns the attempted assassination of the crown, the murder of a royal apprentice, conspiracy against the kingdom, and treason. The hall fell completely silent. Ethan rose from the royal seat. There will be no hidden judgment, no private sentence. The people whose loyalty was betrayed deserve to hear the truth. Marcus presented the recovered evidence one piece at a time. The damaged carriage mechanism, the forged workshop orders, the false witness statements, the concealed dagger. Finally, the written records Eleanor had quietly assembled from dozens of servants. Each document built upon the last. Every lie collapsed beneath careful facts. Then Ethan looked toward Adrian. You may answer. The steward slowly raised his head. For 12 years I served faithfully. No one questioned my loyalty. You question it now because one frightened waitress imagined she saw something. Murmurs spread across the hall. Adrian continued calmly. Is suspicion now enough to destroy a man's life? Grace remained perfectly still. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. Ethan answered instead. No. Suspicion begins an investigation. Truth ends it. Marcus stepped forward carrying the final written report. He repeated Adrian's exact words from the watchtower. I never placed the explosive. Marcus closed the document. No investigator had mentioned an explosive before that sentence. You revealed knowledge available only to those involved. Silence. Adrian's confident expression finally began to crack. Still, he refused to confess. I misspoke. Marcus looked toward the bound messenger. Then perhaps your partner would like to explain. The messenger laughed bitterly. Partner. He stared directly at Adrian. You promised we'd disappear together. You promised no one would ever find us. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. The messenger continued. I carried messages. I bribed stable workers. He ordered every step. He said once the king died, the throne would belong to those smart enough to seize it. Gasps echoed throughout the chamber. Several nobles lowered their heads in shock. Others stared at Adrian in complete disbelief. For the first time, the steward's composure vanished. His shoulders sagged. Years of carefully maintained dignity disappeared in a single moment. He looked toward Ethan. I built this kingdom. I protected it. I deserved more. Ethan descended the steps of the throne without anger, without triumph. You confused service with ownership. You believed loyalty earned the right to rule. It never has. He stopped before Adrian. A crown belongs to those who protect others, not to those who sacrifice them. Marcus removed the royal seal from Adrian's cloak. The sound of the metal striking the stone floor echoed through the hall. Symbolically, his authority ended before the sentence was even spoken. Ethan turned toward the assembled court. Adrian Holloway is stripped of every title, every privilege, and every office. He will spend the remainder of his life imprisoned for treason and conspiracy. The guards immediately led Adrian away. He never looked back. Only the messenger remained. He quietly lowered his head. I'll testify. I'll tell you every name. Marcus nodded once. Then perhaps fewer innocent people will die. As the prisoners disappeared beyond the great doors, an overwhelming silence settled across the hall. The conspiracy had finally been broken. But everyone present understood one undeniable truth. It had not been uncovered by a noble, nor by a general, nor by a royal advisor. It had begun because a humble waitress refused to ignore one strange detail that everyone else had chosen not to see. People often believe a kingdom is saved by the strength of its king. But sometimes it is saved because one ordinary person refuses to stay silent. Several weeks passed. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Blackwood Castle, and the first signs of spring appeared beyond the ancient stone walls. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Merchants filled the marketplace once again. Children laughed in the castle courtyard. Travelers crossed the northern gate without fear. The conspiracy had been dismantled. Every known accomplice had been arrested. Every secret account uncovered. Every forged document destroyed. For the first time in many years, Blackwood Castle felt peaceful. Grace Walker expected to return quietly to her ordinary life. She continued serving breakfast in the royal dining hall exactly as before. She carried wooden trays, poured tea, cleared empty plates. She never asked for recognition. She never spoke about what she had done. To her, protecting innocent lives had never been something worthy of reward. It had simply been the right thing to do. That morning, however, a royal messenger entered the dining hall. He bowed respectfully. Miss Walker, the Alpha King requests your presence. The entire room fell silent. Grace exchanged a confused glance with Eleanor Hayes. Even Captain Marcus Reed smiled faintly. You should go. Moments later, Grace entered the great hall once more. This time, the room was filled not with accusations, but with the entire royal court. Nobles, military commanders, servants, craftsmen, stable workers. Even the kitchen staff stood quietly along the walls. Ethan Carter stepped down from the throne before anyone else could speak. He stopped only a few feet in front of Grace. You once told me, he said softly, that anyone could have noticed the damaged carriage. Grace lowered her eyes. I believe that. Ethan smiled. No, anyone could have seen it. But only one person chose to act. The hall remained perfectly silent. Ethan turned toward the assembled court. For generations, this kingdom has honored courage shown on the battlefield. He paused. Today, we honor a different kind of courage. The courage to speak when everyone else remains silent. He faced Grace again. You were ignored. You were mocked. You were threatened. And still, you chose to protect people who had never protected you. A royal attendant stepped forward carrying a small velvet cushion. Resting upon it was a silver wolf-shaped brooch engraved with the royal crest. Ethan lifted it carefully. This honor has never before been presented to someone outside the royal guard. He fastened the brooch to Grace's simple medieval dress. It belongs to you. The hall erupted into applause. Servants smiled proudly. Several nobles bowed their heads in respect. Marcus struck one fist against his chest. Eleanor wiped away quiet tears. Grace looked around the room in disbelief. Only weeks earlier, most of these people had barely noticed she existed. Now they stood in recognition of her courage. Ethan raised one hand, and silence gradually returned. From this day forward, he declared, Grace Walker serves this kingdom not as an ordinary waitress, but as royal advisor for civil safety. No servant, traveler, or citizen who brings forward an honest warning will ever again be ignored because of rank. His words echoed through every corner of the great hall. Grace felt tears gather in her eyes. Not because of the title, not because of the applause, but because something greater had changed. A kingdom had learned that wisdom could come from any voice. As the court slowly dispersed, Ethan walked beside her toward the castle balcony overlooking the peaceful valley below. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Grace smiled. I still think someone else would have done the same. Ethan looked across the kingdom she had helped save. Then he quietly answered, Perhaps. But history only remembers the one who actually did. Below them, Blackwood Castle continued its ordinary day beneath the warm spring sunlight. No one could see the countless small choices that had changed the kingdom forever. A waitress had noticed one impossible detail. She had chosen courage over silence. And because of that single decision, an Alpha King lived. A kingdom endured. And everyone learned that true greatness is never measured by the chair someone sits in, but by the choice they make when doing the right thing costs them everything.